Hello and welcome to Everybody Pulls the Tarp. I'm your host, Andrew Moses, and with me today I have a very special guest, Cal Fussman. Welcome to the show, Cal Fussman.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you, Cal. And for my audience, Cal is a New York Times bestselling author. He's a keynote speaker all over the world and the host of the podcast Big Questions. Cal has had the privilege for more than 4 decades now to ask many of the most influential people, leaders, and personalities in the world big questions. And we're going to dig into all the things that Cal has learned across that journey so far here on Everybody Pulls the Tarp. Cal, it's such a great pleasure to have you.
I'm ready to go.
Cal, so where I want to start is going way back in your life. Was there a moment when you said, I'm going to be a guy who makes a living asking influential people big questions?
Absolutely. I can take it back to a single day. November in 1963. I was in my second grade class, youngest kid in the class, shortest guy in the class. And it's the afternoon. All of a sudden, the teacher, Miss Jaffe, kind of leaves the room. She comes back a minute later, and she's like a different person, completely blanched, and starts talking in a voice that's so calm that it was scary. And that's when we learned that President Kennedy had just been shot. So everybody runs home, and we find out that President Kennedy's been assassinated. A little while later, we find out that the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, has taken the oath of office. He's the new president. And so that night, my parents were concerned because this was really the first time that I had ever confronted death. And they didn't know how I would sleep, how I would take it. So they called me over to the kitchen table and they said, Cal, this is a terrible thing that's happened today. But we want you to know this has happened before in our nation's history. And the country has a plan to get through it. That's why Lyndon B. Johnson is the new president. And tomorrow morning, when I'm just sorry to stop the story, I just want to hit my no disturb on the computer.
That's good.
So they said, well, we just want you to know tomorrow morning when you wake up, you're going to have breakfast just like you did last Saturday. You're going to go out and play just like you did last Saturday. And things are going to slowly return to normal. So we just want you to get a good night's sleep and realize that everything's going to be okay. They go off to talk to my brother. I'm sitting at the kitchen table, and I'll show you how young and naive I was. I'm thinking, Lyndon B. Johnson, that guy had to know he was going to be president. Now, I thought that because the only people I ever heard become presidents had middle initials. So I thought if you had a middle initial, you were going to be president, and you knew this from the time you were a little kid. So I'm thinking, all right, this guy knew he was going to be president. Is he happy that he's finally president? Or is he sad that he's the president? Because only reason he's the president is because John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And then I thought, what if he's scared to be the president because they might want to kill him too? So I couldn't get a grip out of what was going on in Lyndon B. Johnson's mind. And so I picked up a piece of paper and a pen and just started writing, Dear President Johnson, how does it feel? You happy? You sad? You scared? Went through a few more possibilities, and then I wished him luck. And we had just learned how to address an envelope in school. So I knew where the envelopes were, And I tucked this letter inside the envelope, wrote on it, President Lyndon B. Johnson, the White House, put my return address in the top left-hand corner, licked the stamp, put it in the top right-hand corner, as I used to do the stamps. And next day, I didn't even tell anybody about this. I just put it in my pocket and I went outside and dropped it in the mailbox. Well, there was a lot of commotion following John F. Kennedy's assassination. The suspect in the killing was shot soon thereafter in jail, or as he was being led in a hallway. And it was just chaotic. And over time, I kind of forgot about the letter that I sent to the president. And it wasn't until about 5 months later when my mom came racing up the steps to our apartment holding an envelope in her right hand. It was from the White House, and it was addressed to me. And we opened it up, and it was the president's response to my questions. And the cool thing about it was he didn't respond like I was a second grader. He was very respectful. And we knew that because the second sentence began something like this: in answer to your query, and I had no idea what a query was, but I did know that the room was soon filled with neighbors who wanted to see the letter from the president, touch the letter from the president, and the principal at the school was calling. He wanted me to bring the letter to school. And I realized that the smallest guy in his second grade class was suddenly a very big man. And the reason I was because I now understood that a great question could get you to the most powerful person on earth. And that has basically guided my life to this day.
What an amazing story, Cal. Why do you think that the president responded? Do you think why do you think the president responded?
Well, it's interesting thing about the letter is there was a misspelling, and that tells you that when his personal assistant, personal secretary Juanita D. Roberts typed it up, it was only typed to me because it wasn't a form letter that went out to everybody. And I imagine that somehow the letter just got passed on from person to person to person till it reached Juanita D. Roberts' desk. And there was something about it that probably made everybody wonder, what was he actually thinking when he took his oath of office? And I got back a kind of a political answer, which actually taught me the most important lesson of all. And that is that the follow-up questions are more important than the first question.
What a great point. So you made a living now for 4 decades, more than 4 decades, asking these big questions. You've traveled the world. You've interviewed many of the most influential people in history. Have you been able to identify a pattern of behavior or a pattern of certain traits that make a good leader maybe a great leader, or a good team a great team?
Well, generally with leaders, the icons that I've interviewed, they've all dreamed big and gone to great heights. And then, for the most part, they fell. And then they got up and went to higher heights.
So this show is called Everybody Pulls the Tarp, and you and I have talked about this. This is all based upon a philosophy that I have, that great teams, great organizations are powered by individuals who contribute far beyond the boundaries of their job description. So as you've met and interacted and questioned these really influential, really powerful people, um, has there been one or two in particular where you said, this one has a really special team around them that's helped them get to those new heights you just described?
Well, what comes to mind is kind of a funny story that always sticks with me, and it gets to the UCLA basketball coach John Wooden.
I love John Wooden. I read all of the John Wooden books.
So you probably know the story that every year, like on the first day of basketball practice, he had all of his players seated, and he began to instruct them on very basic things they needed to do to play for UCLA basketball. And one of those things was how to put on their socks. Now, you can imagine sitting down with not only the freshmen who are hearing this for the first time and are probably surprised, like, I've been putting on my socks for 16 years now. You're going to show me how to put on my socks? But think about it. The guys who were sophomores are now hearing the same story for the second time. The guys who are juniors for the third time. And the guys who are the seniors, this is 4 years in a row that they're hearing how to put their socks on. And the point behind putting your socks on right was that if it wasn't placed on in the most fluid manner and there were wrinkles like at the bottom, that it could cause blisters. And if you got blisters, you weren't going to be at 100%. And that one slight detail might make your performance subpar for a brief second and cost the team a game.
So do you believe that attention to detail is something that you're just born with, or something that you can teach yourself?
Well, if you had John Wooden as your coach, you would learn it pretty quick.
I bet.
And the thing about it is, it set up all the details that he was going to lay on his foundation. But the bottom line, when you think about what was way, way underneath this, was every one of those players who heard that story, and just about all of them heard it 4 times, they were connected, whether they played 10 years apart, because they could all remember hearing that story, rolling their eyes when they were seniors, but it bonded all of them. When any of the two of them could meet for the first time, they could tell that story and know that they were part of the same team.
That's interesting, and especially given the climate that we're in right now with all of the social distancing. Do you, as you think about organizations right now and in the near future and distant future, there's surely going to be more virtualized work going on, and less in-person meetings and less travel. How is that going to? Are we setting ourselves up for a scenario where we don't have as many of those camaraderie building moments that you just described?
Well, I think we are going to evolve into something deeper. This may sound crazy, but think about it. I just told you a story about John Wooden. Hopefully, and maybe I could have done a better job. Maybe I could have told you about Bill Walton or Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar over time, sitting on a bench when they heard that story for the first time. Because Bill Walton has told me that story, and he told it to me with a roll in his eyes. And my point here is that in the time that we cannot physically touch each other, stories are going to be the most important way that we can connect. And as Yuval Noah Harari says, best-selling author, in his book, starts his book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, humans think in stories rather than in facts, numbers, or equations. And the simpler the story, the better. So this is the time for leaders to rely on storytelling, because if the people that they're leading are 10, 20, 50,000 miles away, their stories can still make those deep felt connections. So I think storytelling is going to become more important than it ever was before.
I think you're right, Cal, and you've devoted your life to storytelling. You've told so many great stories, many of which tons that I've enjoyed over the years. I know that there's many that are special to you, but I know your time with Muhammad Ali and that story and the work you've done on Muhammad Ali is special to you as someone who's he's a childhood hero of yours. Talk a minute about how that all came together and what that meant to you and what you learned from your time with Ali.
Well, and just by the length of the podcast and the full length of that story is doesn't overlap, so won't be able to tell the whole thing. But bottom line is that when I went to meet him and I spent a week with him, this was 2003. He had Parkinson's disease, wasn't really speaking above a whisper. And I had to figure out a way to get the answer to the question of what was still in the well. And I use that phrase because oftentimes when he would be fighting and in a difficult spot, he had a corner man named Drew Bundini Brown who would be screaming from the ring apron, "Go to the well once more, champ! Go to the well once more!" And always Ali reached deep inside the well to pull out whatever was at his essence that could take him as high up as it possibly could. And so here I am with one of the world's great communicators who basically was having his voice taken away. And we ended up going to a gym on his farm in Michigan. And there was a big punching bag that we started to hit as if it was a fight between us. And I was imitating the style of Smokin' Joe Frazier, his arch nemesis, and he was boxing as himself. And what happened is, without saying a word, without asking a question, because I could imitate Joe Frazier, and as I'm hitting the bags with left hooks like Joe Frazier did, it brought him back in time. And so I would go to the bag, then he would go to the bag, and he would start to flash combinations. I would throw bigger punches into the bag. His combinations got faster and longer until finally he must have thrown a combination that lasted like 30 or 40 seconds. And it's a long story, and anybody could go to calfussman.com and listen to it in entirety. But at the end, he had pulled everything out of himself and showed, I think, even himself what he still had, because he wasn't exercising that much. And he was just at a place where it was kind of tiresome to work out. And by pushing him to a place where he actually started to dance around the bag like he did when he was young, and he's looking at himself in the mirror, and as he's seeing himself in the mirror, his chest lifted and his head lifted, and then he threw that burst of punches. And it was a moment where I was able to lift him in a way that he had lifted me as a childhood hero. So it was a beautiful experience, and it really taught me how you could ask a question without saying a word.
Interesting. And why are some people just able to dig deep into that well, as you describe, and pull something from it, and others
Well,
aren't?
those are the people that we all know about. We see them as athletes on TV. We see them. Look, you're talking about leaders. Steve Jobs starts Apple, gets banished from Apple, and it's quite interesting because early on, when they were releasing computers, he released a computer named after his daughter to what he thought was much fanfare. They took out like a advertising section in the New York Times that was pages and pages of geek talk about how grand this computer was going to be. And it kind of flopped. And ultimately, he was pushed out of the company. And what he did was his next step, his pivot, was to Pixar. And there he learned about storytelling. And once he learned about storytelling, he came back to Apple. And then they created probably one of the greatest advertisements of all time, the theme of Think Different. And their main competitor was IBM, whose motto was Think. And that ad basically allowed everybody who was creative to see Apple as their go-to product.
That's right.
And so you have an example there of somebody who started something great, went down, then came back, and then took the same company into the stratosphere. And that, I think, is what gets to the answer of your question. Some people can find what's inside them and pivot to a place where they can then take off to that grander place. Other people, they may do something good and it stops. You never hear from them again.
So, you're doing something a little different. You were previously, interviewing all the folks behind the mic. Now you're the host of Big Questions, a phenomenal podcast that you can get wherever you listen to podcasts. What inspired you to get in front of the microphone and start telling your doing your storytelling through a different medium?
Well, and that goes back to the same point, actually, that we just talked about with Steve Jobs. It actually had two people that enabled me to pivot. The first was the broadcaster Larry King, who was on CNN primetime for 25 years and one of the greatest broadcasters of all time. I had gone out to Los Angeles to help him write his soup to nuts autobiography. It's called My Remarkable Journey. In fact, you could probably see the oh, let me go the other way.
There it is.
Yeah, there you go. That was the title page of the book. And so I'm out in LA interviewing Larry because I write a lot of books in people's words. I help them write their books. A lot of the interviews that I did for Esquire magazine is in their words. I'm basically finding the wisdom inside of people and then putting it on paper. And the interesting thing about this time is that I'm going to breakfast with him every day. He had about 6 to 8 buddies who joined him. And there I'm just sitting next to Larry day after day at breakfast. And then we would go to the show at night and he put me right next to his desk so that you couldn't see me on camera, but I'm literally like inhaling his words at breakfast. And then afterwards we might go to dinner. And so I'm just listening and picking up the way he communicates. And one day, a few years later, and this also goes to show you how pulling the tarp works in so many ways. Because one time Larry asked me to pull the tarp. So we're sitting at breakfast and so many people come over to ask Larry for an autograph or to say hello or for a photo. And one day a young guy comes in. He had dropped out of college at USC. It's kind of a longer story, but I'll try and get through it as quick as I can. This kid was an immigrant whose parents raised him to be a doctor, to the point where, like, when he's 6 years old, he would go out for Halloween dressed in scrubs. I mean, that's how his parents wanted him to see himself. And he actually believed that he was going to be a doctor because it was inculcated into his brain. And then he got to USC and he got a big stack of biology books and he realized he couldn't get through them.
I couldn't either.
Yeah, there you go. And he had there was no overlap between him and a doctor. Even though there were many people in his family who were doctors, he just was not going to be a doctor. And he was actually scared to even tell his family that he wasn't going to be a doctor. But eventually he did. They couldn't bear it. And he had this sort of life crisis. He started wondering about success. And he began wondering, like, what were the most successful people doing when they were my age, when they were 19, when they were 20? He went to the library and he's looking for books about Bill Gates and Lady Gaga, and he's trying to find the answer to the question, and he wasn't. So he decided to try and write the book that he wanted to read. And he tried to get interviews with Bill Gates and Lady Gaga and Oprah Winfrey. And he started to realize that it was a lot harder than he thought. Number one, he couldn't get the interviews. And number two, even when he did get the interviews, he didn't know how to ask questions. So he wasn't getting the material that he needed. And so he reached out to Larry King to see if he could get some advice on asking questions. And this is the pull the tarp moment. He comes to the breakfast table and Larry asks him, well, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm writing a book. And Larry looks at me and says, okay, Cal writes books. Cal asks great questions. Cal, can you give him 5 minutes? And, the idea was just talk to him for a few minutes, give him some nuggets of advice, and then come back and finish breakfast. And so I sat down and I didn't really know where this kid was at. And I asked him, are heroes dead? And he said, oh, no. And the reason I asked him the question was because Muhammad Ali I think had just passed, Nelson Mandela had just passed. And I didn't really see these people in the world coming up anymore. And he said, oh no, heroes are still alive? I said, well, who's your heroes? And he said, Tim Ferriss. And I said, Tim Ferriss? Who is Tim Ferriss? I never heard of Tim Ferriss. How could he be a hero if I never heard of him? You got to know who a hero is in order for him to be a hero or her to be a hero.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, no, you have to understand. Tim Ferriss has a podcast that millions of people are listening to. And he's written this book, The 4-Hour Workweek. And so I got very curious about Tim Ferriss. And at the end of our conversation, we agreed to meet again. And we started to have some long conversations. And I started to help him with his book. And the book is now out. It's a bestseller. It's called The Third Door. And I mentored him through it over 5 years of sessions, 3 nights a week, because he had to learn how to interview, how to write. And the interesting thing about it was that I wasn't realizing was that he was mentoring me, because he was looking at me saying, I don't get this, Cal. You've spent time with presidents and Mikhail Gorbachev and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. And yet, nobody in my generation, unless they read Esquire, which not that many of them do, nobody knows who you are. You don't even exist. He said, you're not on Wikipedia. You're not on Facebook. You're not on Twitter. And I said, what do you mean I don't exist? I'm doing fine. And he's explained the importance of being attached to social media to me. This is right around the time after the Great Recession. And we became very close. And he introduced me to other mentors. One of those other mentors is a guy named Elliot Bisnow, who had a company called Summit that brought in entrepreneurs from around the world. And Elliot asked if I would speak at one of his conferences. It was on a cruise ship, 4,000 entrepreneurs. And I'd never spoken before, but I got up to speak. And at the end of the talk, an hour later, I got a standing ovation. And there's a long line of people to meet me. And one of them said, how long have you been speaking? I said, about an hour and a half. And he said, well, let me tell you something. I make a living as a speaker. And that's what you should be doing. So because Larry asked me to pull the tarp, and because I was open to pulling the tarp and helping this young guy, actually, the tarp was pulled for me.
What a great message, right? You know, that when you build a connection with someone at that level, how it really works both ways. Here he thinks he's going to learn from you, and you've grown through learning from him. It's an amazing story. Cal, I want to be sensitive to your time. I could ask you questions for the next 20 hours, but this has been so much fun, a great thrill for me as someone who really enjoys your work. Again, you know, I encourage everyone listening to check out Big Questions, available, you know, anywhere where you listen to your podcasts. And Cal, it's been, like I said, a great pleasure to have you on. Keep asking those great questions, and we'll all keep learning.
Thank you so much. And I apologize. I didn't have the time to tell the full Ali story, but anybody can go to calfussman.com and find the video, and you'll get it in all its glory.
We'll make sure everybody gets it. Cal, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Andrew, and keep it up. You have a very fluid way about you, and I can see a big future for you.
Thank you, Cal.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.